In our very brief first reading, we heard this line: "The Lord has forsaken me. The Lord has forgotten me." Is there any worse feeling than that? To be alone, to be abandoned, to be forgotten by God. Suffering takes many different forms in our world, but ultimately the cry of the suffering person is the same. The Lord has forsaken me. The Lord has forgotten me. Suffering always seems like God has abandoned us. When we experience suffering, it seems that He has left us and has left our side. Especially when we look at the gospel promise that He makes today. He's telling us not to worry. I will take care of you. I will provide food and shelter and clothing for you. Do not worry. When He tells us that in the gospel, and then we experience suffering in our own life, it seems that it must be the case that since I'm suffering, He has left me. He has left me and has abandoned me. Suffering is often then viewed by us as a punishment from God. He has abandoned us because we have done something wrong. And so then it paralyzes us very often in our lives. When we experience pain and when we experience suffering, it causes us to freeze. We're not sure what exactly we've done to anger God, and so we don't know exactly what to correct. So we just stand still, hoping that, whatever reason God has left us, He will one day return and drive our suffering away from us. That is the way I think that we commonly think of suffering. But instead, I'd like to offer what the church has to say about suffering. A different message than the one that we often tell ourselves when we are suffering. I think oftentimes it's thought that priests sit around and read papal encyclicals. It's not exactly true, but one of them that I do like very much and is very brief, and I would actually even recommend to all of you, is by Pope John Paul II, and it's simply titled, "On Human Suffering." It's shorter than some of the stuff that you typically see from the church and seems to be something that we can all understand. It might be good reflection for us as we head into or start into our Lenten journey on human suffering. John Paul II doesn't really teach anything ground-shakingly new in that encyclical or in that letter that he wrote. He basically, though, reminds us, and he just brings together for us the teaching of the church since the beginning on the issue of suffering that we endure in our lives. He says in there that yes, sometimes, very rarely, suffering is a punishment, but almost always it isn't. So then the question, why do we suffer? Why do we experience suffering as human beings? And he says that there are two reasons, and I think that we do well to reflect on those this evening. First of all, the Holy Father, the late Holy Father, reminds us that suffering is good for us. Is good for us, and that sounds very odd and very strange. But the church is in the business of sounding odd and strange. Suffering is good for us. Why is that? When we endure suffering, whatever form it may be, whether it be mental, emotional, physical suffering, whenever we endure that suffering, and whenever we encounter that moment where we feel abandoned by God, it forces us to ask the difficult questions, the real questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? What does it mean to be alive? I often use the analogy with my students at Cardinal Ritter, and I use it because I am the one that is accused of this first and foremost. But I like to use the analogy of the lazy river. You maybe have seen that at Kings Island or some of the other theme parks. You simply get in an inner tube and you float down the river, and that's the ride. That is what you do sometimes for a half hour, or I guess you could spend all day on the lazy river if you want. The thing about the lazy river is that is an analogy, I think, for us sometimes when we aren't really having to suffer. When we're not forced to ask the important questions of life, we can get in that mode where we're just floating along. Suffering, though, shakes us out of that. It forces us out of the lazy river that we are sometimes finding ourselves in, and it makes us say, now what is this all about again? What is this life that I'm living? What does it mean? For us, those who are on the lazy river, that is why Christ says to us that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus doesn't not like rich people. He's not saying, I just don't want a lot of rich people in heaven or blessed people in heaven. He's trying to tell us that if we never are shaken out of that comfort zone that we're in, if we never experience suffering, then it's going to be very hard for us to ever do anything important, to ever ask ourselves any of the important questions. So suffering, first of all, encourages us to step out of that zone that we can sometimes find ourselves in. Suffering is also good for us then because it brings us aware of the suffering people that are around me. If I'm not suffering, I'm a lot less likely to notice the suffering of people around me. But when I am hungry, when I am alone, when I am abandoned, it is in those moments that I'm much more likely to reach out to and notice the people in my community, in my church, in my family who are suffering. So suffering then makes it easier to answer the call to care for the poor and the abandoned that Christ makes so often in the Gospels. My suffering, though, is not only good for me, the Holy Father reminds us in his letter, he also talks about how my suffering can be good for other people. And that is something that I don't think we often think about today, but I think is very important for us. We hear in St. Peter's letter to the Christian community that he was writing to, he says this, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example. Leaving you an example. We often think about the fact that Christ had to die on the cross in order for us to be saved. In actuality, we remember back to the Christmas story where Herod's soldiers are searching for Christ, and Christ is a newborn child. If those soldiers had found Christ and had killed him, we would still be saved. Christ would have come, taken on human flesh, and he would have died. His life then, after Christmas, is all about showing us how to live. He is giving us an example. He is showing us this is the way that you need to live. This is the way that you need to live. Suffering. He is telling us when you endure suffering, that you will find then the ultimate meaning of what I'm calling you to. Our suffering actually can not only convert our lives, we can apply that suffering to other people, those who are suffering in our midst. Pope John Paul II says that Christ has raised human suffering to the level of redemption. He has allowed our suffering to be applied to other people and to help save them. Why? Because his suffering did that for us. Because Christ's suffering saved us, our suffering can be charged and can be offered up for those around us. So if I'm enduring suffering, I can actually say, Lord, please take this suffering that I'm enduring and apply it to my family. Give it to those who I know who are suffering, those who are hungry, those who have been abandoned by their parents or who have been abused, those of my friends who are struggling, that we may offer our suffering up at the end to the sins of our nation, for those who are in areas of war and violence and strife. We can offer our suffering up for that. And so when we're in the midst then of suffering, it's not that my first thought is, God's abandoned me. It's, how can I use this suffering for other people? That should be the question that we're asking. Those who don't suffer because of the situation that they find themselves in, those of us who are fortunate enough to maybe not have to be in a position where we're suffering daily, the church encourages us to instead look for small things that can cause suffering to us. Now that sounds masochistic, and the church is often accused of that. You may remember in the Da Vinci Code there's a monk who continues to just beat himself constantly. And that is the image, I think, that society sometimes has of the church. The church tells everybody to suffer needlessly because they're masochists. But in fact, that's those small sufferings that we do, that the church is asking us to do if we're not in a position where we already are suffering, is designed to wake us up, designed to shake us out of the slumber that we may be finding ourselves in. One of the church fathers says about one type of suffering, fasting, that fasting is a luxury of the rich. It's a luxury to get to choose suffering, because most of the world doesn't get to choose to suffer. So if we're in a position where we can choose that, we should give thanks. We have an opportunity approaching quickly on the horizon where we can take on small things and suffer and help those in our midst and those in the whole world. Lent. Lent is an opportunity to focus and to take up small crosses throughout our day and to suffer in small ways that no one will ever see or know, and to then take that suffering and help bring about the redemption of the whole world. Finally, John Paul II says that suffering exists to unleash love. To unleash love. May we, when our suffering, whether we've chosen it or whether it's been placed upon us by our Heavenly Father, may we look to the cross. And may we know that we are not alone in suffering, but that our God is drawing us ever near to Himself, who also endured suffering, that we may be saved.